Hi folks, we trust you were able to see that first video that we did about Transformed by the Spirit and what it's about, and as we described it as being a relationship between who we are as Baptists engaging the local, and that it's really about risk and experiment in joining God in our local communities. And what I want to do in this particular video is talk to you about how to go on that journey as a local congregation. And what I want to introduce to you is something that we call the 5-step process, so that each congregation that is involved in Transformed by the Spirit is going to be walking through and journeying with each other through the same set of steps together. And I want to now just outline for you what those steps are in order to then describe how, as a cluster of Baptist churches across the USA, you can join with others on that journey. So the 5-step process, is really about 5 simple steps that you will take in your congregation. The first step we call listening. So the first step on this journey is learning some practices together of listening. Now, what do we mean by listening? Because you see, if what we believe is that God's Spirit is already ahead of us in our neighborhoods and communities, then it's going to become very important for us to learn how to listen to what's happening in our neighborhoods and communities. And this, in many ways, is a shift of orientation. Because very often, and I was a pastor for many, many years and was guilty of this myself, we basically make some assumptions in our churches about what our community needs, and then we take it to them. This is about something different. How do we learn to listen to what's happening in our community? And so, in the first step of listening, you are going to be invited as a congregation to do 2 things. One is to take Scripture, and particularly around Luke 10, 1 through 12, the story where Jesus sends 70 into towns and villages, into neighborhoods. We're going to take that text and we're going to learn together how to sit before that text and listen to God through one another. So this is not going to be your classic Bible study, and there's not going to be an expert in the midst telling us what the text says, but we are going to listen to what the Spirit might be saying to us through one another. So that's the first part of the listening that we're going to do through dwelling in the Word. The second part of the listening that we're going to do is learn how to do some simple walking through our neighborhoods at various times of the day and ask some questions of ourselves in order to see our neighborhood with fresh eyes and in order to listen to our neighborhood with fresh ears. I don't know whether you're like me, but I drive in and out of my neighborhood. And I realize that when I drive, I see only a very limited set of things. And so what we want to do is open up our eyes and our ears to our neighborhood and our community and begin to ask at a very simple level, what are some things that we're seeing and where might God be present? So the first step then is listening. The second step of the journey we call discerning. Now, discerning is not about analysis. It's not about data. It's not about counting. It's not about asking, where do the social service say there are some needs? Discerning is a spiritual discipline and exercise which, coming out of the listening that we're doing in Scripture and in our community, we begin to ask this question: where might we be seeing God at work in our communities and neighborhoods? And as we look at where we might see God at work in our neighborhoods and communities, where might there be places where we can join with what God is doing in our neighborhoods and communities? This we call discerning. And you will spend a period of time together as a congregation learning how to do that discerning. That's the second stage. The third stage we call experimenting. Now, an experiment is not a complicated thing. An experiment is something that you and I do all the time. We did it more as children than we do now. I have grandchildren, and many of my grandchildren live with me, and I watch them learning to ride bikes. I watch them learning to do new tasks. And I realize that all the time they're experimenting. And I realized that, the way we learn as children needs to be the way we learn as churches. That when you do something new, you try, and a lot of times it just doesn't work. But because you've tried, you've learned some things, and you can try again. So what we're going to do out of the listening and the discerning is invite you as a congregation to name a small number of places where you could create some experiments in joining with God in the neighborhood. And we have ways of helping you to do that. So that's the third step. Experimenting, actually doing the work of going out and being present with God in the neighborhood. For example, my wife, who's wonderful at this, has created a book club. And so she engages with a number of women, sitting together, talk about books. And when you begin to do that, it's amazing the things that start to happen. We have some friends who, when it came to this stage, they began, one of the women, Mary, she just began to hang out at a local Starbucks regularly, 2 or 3 times a week. And out of that simple experiment, got to know some people in the community and began some conversations that led to some amazing connections. So these are not difficult, complex experiments. They're simple things. You can become the manager of the soccer team in the community. There are endless ways of doing these experiments. I was just talking to a friend who didn't quite know what to do about experimenting, and so they, on their front boulevard, they created a simple garden and put a sign up that said, anybody that wants these produce is welcome to them. And you have no idea how, when people saw that, they began to connect and to talk, and the God conversations that emerge are amazing. So, experiments. The fourth thing that we're going to do after the experiments is what we call reflection. Now, what I mean by that is that the way we learn is that we reflect upon what we've done. And we say, what did we do? What worked? What didn't work? How would you do it differently? And our experience is that if you don't reflect upon what you've done, we really don't learn anything. So reflection becomes a key part of that. And then after reflection, the final step is a very simple one. We ask, what then are the new experiments? In other words, based upon what we've learned, what worked, what didn't work, we create new experiments and we work again. And in that way, we begin to discover not only what God's up to ahead of us, but how we can join with God who is ahead of us. And that begins to transform our church by the Spirit of God. Thank you.